So if you know me, you know that there are two things that I hate. One is nuclear war. The other is the 1990s. I was a teenager in the 1990s, early 1990s, and went into my 20s by the end. That's how it works. That's how aging works. And I hated it. I didn't like the music. I generally didn't care for the movies. There are some great movies from the 90s, don't get me wrong. But I generally didn't care for the movies. I hated the fashion. There's just a lot about the 90s that I did not care for. But it was a great time for tabletop RPGs. Not only was it a great time for tabletop RPGs because I was a teenager and in my early 20s, I worked at a game store. So I was very lucky to do a ton of gaming, an absolute insane amount of gaming with some wonderful people. I gamed with so many different people, and so many of them were great. I mean, yeah, there's always some who aren't. But generally speaking, I was very lucky. I was in very good groups. I had lots and lots of good times. It was a great time. It was also kind of a great time, turns out, in hindsight, because conspiracy theories were still fun. People, generally speaking, normal, everyday people who held jobs and voted, didn't, at least on the surface, didn't believe in conspiracy theories. It was just good fun. It was something you read. You read the cover of the Weekly World News when you were waiting at the grocery store, and you had a good laugh about Bat Boy going off to fight in Desert Storm. It was all in good fun. People didn't seriously believe a lot of this nonsense. And when you had somebody who did, you smiled, you nodded, you backed away, tried not to make eye contact, and then laughed about it with your friends later. Sadly, the world we live in today is not that same world. However, a little bit of nostalgia for the 90s, which is not something you'll hear me say a lot, there is the Delta Green source book for the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game. This was in the heyday of the X-Files, stuff like that. So you kind of had your Call of Cthulhu take on that sort of thing. Secret government organizations, alien invasions, the conspiracies around them, all that sort of thing. It was a very cool book that came out, a setting book from Pagan Publishing for the Call of Cthulhu RPG. Over time, that has had a new edition, which I have not picked up, and it's also had the spin-off game, The Fall of Delta Green, set in, I think it's the 1960s or early 70s, I can't remember exactly. But it was a great setting, very cool lore. And they had for it a second big book, my paperwork's on the bottom, that's handy, called Countdown, which really it's a massive tome. And compared to the original book, you can see the size is noticeable. And this was a big expansion for the setting of Delta Green, and it covered a lot of material. So what I have is the print-on-demand version, and you notice that I am giving it a little look-see. That is because this is actually my second copy. My first copy that I got was damaged in transit, and I'm just checking the binding. Yes, okay, so comparable binding. I was a little worried that perhaps it had a problem with the binding, but it seems fine. The first copy I got was damaged in transit, and it's taken quite a while to get this copy in. The reason why I have this copy is because I sold off my original. I don't care about the collectability of the original thing, but somebody did because they paid me decent money for it. And I was able to then upgrade, I think, to a hardcover, which will last longer, assuming that the binding is good. It does look a little bit off, but I don't think it's going to be so bad. Anyhow, you take a look through. And this is basically just it's the original source book, I guess, scanned or whatever, and then put into this print-on-demand hardcover from DriveThruRPG. DriveThru was very good about getting me a replacement copy. They didn't argue. They didn't put up a fight. It took a while, and I think that's what was a little frustrating to me. And this is just being spoiled. Over the last year or so, when I've ordered stuff from DriveThru, it has come in very, very quickly. And when I made this order, it took a good deal longer than previous things that I have ordered took. And then not an unreasonable amount of time, but after you've gotten spoiled with very quick turnaround, having a not so quick turnaround is a little frustrating. And then it happened to be when they were shipping was coinciding with a time that I was away. So there was some stress there, blah, blah, blah. And then it finally showed up, and I was very excited, and I opened it up, and the cover was all kind of smashed up, which was very frustrating. So anyway, I reached out, contacted them. They very quickly resolved the issue and said, we'll print you another copy and send it. Now, in keeping with the previous order, the order that the damaged book came from, it took quite a while for the printing to happen and for it to then arrive. Once it shipped, it was actually only a few days, but it was about 2 weeks or so. Again, not unreasonable for print on demand. It really isn't. But again, I'm spoiled. After having a week turnaround from the moment I place the order to the moment it's in my hand for several orders, it was a little tough waiting for 2.5 weeks for stuff to show. Almost 3 weeks. Anyway, this book covers a whole bunch of material. You can see there's not a ton of illustrations. The illustrations that are in here are very cool. I don't want to show that one because it's a little bit, but the illustrations that are in here, I think, are very well done. This, I feel like, if my memory serves, I haven't read the Delta Green books since they were new. So it's been a while. But my memory is that this gets a little more international. I think there's a little bit of international in the first one, but I think this gets a lot more into some international groups, gets some more into some other conspiracies, and just really fleshes out the setting quite a bit so that there's a lot you can do. I'm not going to flip through every page, but it's gotten me thinking about it again. I like Delta Green a lot. I never ran it. Never even played. I played in a GURPS X-Files game, which is the closest that I've ever come. I don't know that I'm as interested in getting the new game. I think if I were actually to run Delta Green, if I were to use the Delta Green material, first off, I'd almost certainly stay within Call of Cthulhu because it's the game that I know, I'm familiar with it. It's easy for me to run. But I also have this idea, and I'm sure I'm not the first person who had this. I always sort of had this idea of running a game that was a series of connected scenarios over the 20th century, starting probably with the build-up to the raid on Innsmouth, and then going forward through the fall of Delta Green, or first the establishment of Delta Green, then through Hastur. I love Pagan Publishing's take on Hastur and the King in Yellow and all that sort of thing, mythology. That really did a lot to sort of shape my views on Hastur, on the King in Yellow, and even on the mythos. I feel like there was a lot of Pagan Publishing work in the 90s that I really clicked with, and I clicked with their interpretation, which is very, very different from the interpretation of, say, like an August Derleth. Getting more into the idea of the mythos as some of the really powerful things, Azathoth, Shub-Niggurath, Hastur, that sort of thing, being less willful beings and more manifestations of concepts within the universe, beyond, obviously, like a lot of Lovecraftian stuff, but beyond our comprehension, yet these essential building blocks. And you could think of Azathoth as, chaotic creation, Hastur as entropy, Yog-Sothoth as physics, Shub-Niggurath as biology, the basis of life everywhere, that sort of thing. So I found those really interesting. And then, you slide over to things like Cthulhu and I to belittle such a monstrous thing at some time, Cthulhu is essentially just an alien, not that much different from us. He's just a being. Now, he is obviously fundamentally different from us, maddening, beyond our comprehension, possibly not entirely in our set of dimensions. All of that, sure, yes, but at the end of the day, still a being with a will and a thought and a plan, maybe beyond anything we understand, but it is understandable that it is a creature like us. And that would be, the same with some of the other ones that, obviously the Migo and those sort of things. But with some of the big, super strange ones, they're not beings per se. Anyway, that's the interpretation that I take with it. And then what you face, if you face off against one of those things, you're facing off essentially a physical manifestation, a breakaway thought. If you face a thing that is Yog-Sothoth, you're not facing Yog-Sothoth, you're facing a splintered concept that has leaked off and corrupted the world in a certain way to become this manifestation of Yog-Sothoth, that sort of thing, blah, blah, blah. That's my thought on things. Now, Nyarlathotep is where it gets tricky, because is Nyarlathotep a being? It seems to have will. Is it a being, or is it the concept of will? And then the many masks that you face, or the many different versions of Nyarlathotep, are they simply splinter wills, splinter factions, and the idea of having will manifested into this person, thing, what have you? I don't know. Yeah, so that was me ranting a little bit about stuff and doing a flip through of this book. Isn't that swell? So, and, this book's not perfect, but it is definitely in better shape. A slight problem. It's in much better shape than what I received the first time around, which was pretty crinkled up. And, normally with these print-on-demand books, like some of the modules I've picked up, it's not that big a deal if the cover's a little folded or something like that, because, it's like a $6 paperback thing that I just got to use in-game. But this I want to have on my shelf. This is something I'm going to want to be able to come back and read at different times. And it's also, while not collector price expensive, it wasn't cheap. It's a hardcover. I think it was $45 or $48 or something like that on DriveThru. So I don't want to spend that money and have a bent up thing. So anyway, kudos to DriveThru for fixing that issue. I really appreciate that. And this is Delta Green Countdown. You can get both Delta Green and Delta Green Countdown on DriveThru. Delta Green's cheaper. I think it was under 30. I might be wrong. And this was like 45, maybe close to 50. I can't remember exactly. The two books combined, though, give you a ton of material, an absolute ton of material to mine for a now no longer modern, but a 90s set or up to the 90s set 20th century Call of Cthulhu game, getting into aliens, conspiracies, weird organizations, governmental duplicitousness, all sorts of things like that. It's really great stuff. I say that having never actually played it, so maybe I'm talking out of my butt, except that a lot of people do seem to like it. I know the new version of the game is quite popular. chances are, especially considering that in the 30 years I've owned these, I have never actually run Delta Green. Chances are I'm not going to ever get into the new version of it. I think that these games, certainly combined with what's in Fall of Delta Green, which I still need to sit down and actually pour over, I think will give me plenty to do with 20th century games. And for me, I think part of Call of Cthulhu's charm has always been the time aspect of it. I love the setting of the 1920s. So if I ran this, I would love the setting of, say, setting in the 1970s, setting in the 1990s. If I run it in contemporary as of when this book came out, it is now a period piece. You know, we're talking about the days before the internet was ubiquitous, before cell phones were personal computers that you carried in your pocket, before any of that sort of thing. I mean, you're still on dial-up internet. You're still, doing all. If you even had internet, you were going to libraries and internet cafes and things like that. College campuses. I mean, in the 90s, most of my computer use was at a college campus. Because I had a personal computer at one point. I had an Apple IIe, didn't really go online at all. I don't think it had the ability. And then I got a PC with Windows 95, which was garbage. And I did some dial-up stuff with it, but it was garbage. It was essentially useless. So it was when I went to college campus in the mid-late 90s that I was able to actually access the early internet and see some of what that was. Anyhow, different world. The 90s were a different world. And I think we were just starting to wake up to some of the problems that we have around today. Right-wing extremists and, American terrorists, essentially. You had that sort of thing was just really hitting with some of the groups that were around and starting to make their early waves in that sort of thing. And you had it was a different time. I'll put it that way. The 90s were a different time. Still hate the music. I still hate the fashion. Still don't like a lot of the movies. Although, that's the thing about the 90s with the neo-puritanical movement of the 90s and trying to get violence and sex out of films, failing frequently, but trying real hard. All of a sudden it feels like everything old is new again, because that's going on again today, where, our films are pretty darn sexless, and we're getting back to the violence of the Western and the James Bond movie, where you can kill hundreds and hundreds of people so long as you don't show any physical or mental repercussions from that. And as long as there are no repercussions, it's PG-13 and it's okay for kids. But if you show any actual suffering or pain or emotional damage or anything from violence, then it's R or it's NC-17. Because, why not? So it feels like those days are coming back. So maybe my hatred of the 90s prepared me for the contemporary living in America. We'll see. Anyhow, Delta Green, that was a long tangent and a runoff. But here's Delta Green. Check it out. It's very cool. Thanks again to DriveThru for taking care of a problem. If not really quickly, immediately, and, with pleasantness. They took care of me very well. All right, thanks. Check out the stuff below as usual. Like, subscribe if you feel like it. Whatever. It's YouTube. You're not new here. All right, take care.